Well, welcome everybody. Our first paper today is going to be presented by Ilya Soman on the subject of originalism and political ignorance. So Ilya will speak first, and then John McGuinness will be our commentator. I guess you two got to know each other when Ilya was fellowshipping at Northwestern,
Yes.
Is that right? Very good. And so you'll speak to it, reply from Ilya, and then questions.
Should I speak from here?
I suggest going up there, yeah.
Thank you. So I'd like to start out by thanking Mike Rappaport, Mike Ramsey, and the Center for the Study of Originalism for organizing this great conference with so many interesting papers and presentations. I'd also like to thank my old friend John McGuinness for commenting and Larry for moderating. And if it's not untoward, I'd like to congratulate John on his recent marriage. Congratulations. Now, yes, indeed. Now, going on to perhaps a slightly less happy subject than that, which is the issue of originalism and political ignorance. As I think I probably don't need to tell this crowd, the last 10 to 20 years has seen a dramatic upsurge in constitutional theory of the popularity not just of originalism generally, but of original meaning originalism specifically. Many leading scholars from across the political spectrum, including several of you who are here in this room, have endorsed this theory over the last 10 or 20 years. A recent piece by James Ryan says that this is the most popular theory, the dominant theory in his view in constitutional academia today. Even if that's not true, it certainly has risen tremendously in reputation and has generated enormous and rapidly growing literature. However, one problem that I think hasn't really been focused on very much in this literature, if at all, is the issue of the challenge of political ignorance to our efforts to try to understand what the original meaning of a particular constitutional provision is. So in the first part of my presentation, I'm going to briefly explain why widespread political ignorance is in fact a problem for originalism, and particularly original meaning originalism. In the second, I'll briefly talk about several possible solutions to this problem. I think those solutions all have at least some merit, but they also have some problems with them, and this is, I think, going to be an issue that will continue to be an issue for originalism, and one that both originalists and their critics should pay attention to. Now, I should say right off the bat that I'm not come to bury original meaning originalism. I'm actually sympathetic to it in many ways. However, I think this is an issue for the theory, and it's one that deserves greater attention. So what is the original meaning? How do we know what it is? When I looked into this with the help of some of my RAs, I found out actually that different students of original meaning define the original meaning differently. However, the most popular variant, the one endorsed by many leading scholars and by many originalist jurists, such as Justice Clarence Thomas, is simply that the original meaning is what the public at the time of ratification thought that provision of the Constitution meant. It's easy to see how political ignorance could be a problem for this variant of original meaning. After all, if the public was unaware of that constitutional issue or unaware of any particular answer that was given to the issue by the constitutional amendment or provision of the original Constitution in question, then it may be difficult or impossible to determine what the original meaning is. There may not even be an original meaning there. I would make a similar point about John McGuinness and Michael Rappaport's important innovation in originalist theory, original methods of originalism. Here, too, I think there's an implicit assumption that the public at the time had at least some knowledge of what the methods that would be used, what methods would be used to interpret that provision of the Constitution. And indeed, knowledge about methods in many ways is probably less common in the general public than knowledge about substantive provisions of the Constitution and what they might mean. At first sight, there is a third theory or a third variant of original meaning which may avoid this problem entirely, and that is the approach advocated by Gary Lawson and Jack Balkin, that the original meaning is what a hypothetical, well-informed person would believe it to be at the time. According to Gary Lawson, this individual is actually a, quote, formidable intellectual figure who has a great deal of knowledge about legal interpretation, the meaning of the Constitution, and so forth. I think even for this variant of original meaning, political ignorance can be a problem because the more this hypothetical formidable intellectual figure is different from the actual people out there at the time, the less connection he or she has to what actually went on historically, and therefore the less connection the hypothetical figure has to the reasons, the normative reasons why people have put forward for why original meaning is an attractive theory. And I can get into that more in questions if people here, I know at least one person here is an advocate of that version of theory, so I'd be happy to talk about this in more detail. Now, I readily admit that this issue is more significant for the original meaning of some parts of the Constitution than for others. There are some parts of the Constitution where the text is extremely clear and where it was very widely and carefully discussed at the time exactly what it would mean, and there even a relatively ignorant voter might very easily understand what the provision means without much difficulty, at least if they made the minimal effort to bother to read it. However, many of the most controversial parts of the Constitution, the ones that we're debating at this conference, in fact, among other conferences, are ones which have broad, somewhat vague wording, and also ones that relate to issues that did not arise or were not much discussed at the time of ratification. And it is precisely there where political ignorance is most likely to be an issue. It's least likely that the voters would focus on these matters. Now, I think it's also the case that political ignorance would not be much of an issue for originalism if the evidence showed that actually the voters were highly knowledgeable about what goes on with constitutional law and the like. However, for the 80 years during which we have had survey evidence, that is decidedly not the case, both on general political issues and on constitutional issues. Specifically, for instance, most of the public consistently cannot do things like name more than one right that is protected by the First Amendment, or know which branch of government has the power to declare war, and the like. Now, in fairness, we do not have nearly as good evidence about public knowledge of constitutional law in the 18th and 19th centuries, the periods when many of the most important parts of the Constitution were enacted. However, the limited qualitative evidence that we do have suggests that political knowledge, if it was higher, probably was not that much higher than it is today. I get into this in more detail in the paper and can talk about it in the questions. It's also perhaps worth noting that James Madison, a founding father, was actually very interested in the issue of political ignorance at the time when the Constitution was being ratified or was being considered in Virginia. He actually said that in his opinion, many parts of the Constitution were far too complicated for most of the Virginia voters to understand. Now, we don't have survey data from 1788 Virginia, so I don't know for sure whether Madison was right about that or not. However, he was a knowledgeable politician. He did have a good understanding of his constituents, so it's quite possible that he was close to the truth. Now, assuming that this is a problem in at least many areas in terms of determining the original meaning, how can we resolve the problem? Well, one obvious approach, the one that I think is already implicit in much originalist scholarship, is just to rely on the opinions of well-informed elites as sort of a proxy for the general public. I think actually much very good originalist scholarship already does this. I think looking to elite opinions is, in fact, very useful. However, it has some limitations. One limitation is that in part precisely because of their knowledge, elites often have quite different views from those of the general public. The second is the more we're relying on the views of a small group of well-informed elites, the more original meaning originalism begins to look like original intent originalism, which also is trying to divine the views of a particular small group of elites, and the more, therefore, original meaning might be susceptible to some of the criticisms that led a lot of people to reject original intent. A second methodology, which is becoming more popular in the literature recently, is to look at communications about the meaning of the constitutional provision that were directed at the general public, such as in the 19th century, especially newspapers. I think this is a promising methodology that deserves more attention. However, it has limitations as well. The biggest one probably is that we know from modern survey data that the voters are often unaware even of fairly basic political information that is in the newspapers. For instance, after the 2010 election, the majority of the public was not aware that the Republicans had won the House but not won the Senate, even though that was obviously widely covered in the press. Third, one could say, well, maybe the voters could in fact understand what's going or have a sense of the original meaning through information shortcuts, using small bits of information as proxies for deeper and broader bodies of knowledge. There is a large literature on this in political science and economics, and one that I've commented on in some of my other publications. For now, what I would say is that while it's certainly possible that the voters understood some things through information shortcuts, it certainly can't be assumed automatically that they did, and it's especially less likely with relatively more complex parts of the Constitution or the provisions that were being debated at the time. Finally, of course, we can adopt a hybrid approach. We can say, let's try to do all of these things simultaneously, and indeed, where possible, where the evidence allows it, I think using more than one of these methods is a lot better than using just one alone. They can, to some extent, offset each other's weaknesses. However, it will probably be the case that in some instances, none of these methodologies will fully avail, and there may not be a clear original meaning, either because there was no real original meaning in the first place, or because we simply don't have enough evidence to discover what the public really believed, or what most of them believed about this particular issue. So I think the bottom line is this. I think this is a real potential problem for original meaning originalists, one that both the supporters and the critics of the theory should attend to more fully. At the same time, I don't think it's a fatal problem, and the extent to which it's a problem will vary from issue to issue. And the best part of it is that I hope people like me who study both originalism and political ignorance can hopefully get some more articles out of it, which is perhaps the real point of this endeavor in the first place. So with that, I turn over the floor to John, and I very, very much look forward to his and all the rest of your comments, since I hope to revise this paper significantly before sending it out. Thank you very much.